Hi, sixth graders. So the last couple of days we've been talking about percents, fractions, and decimals. Today we are going to talk about finding the percent of a number. So we are on chapter 2, lesson 7, if you're following along in your book. So let's start with our real world link. So it says, in a survey, 200 students chose their favorite snacks. So I'm going to underline that number, 200 students. Use the table to find out the number of students who chose each snack. So the first one it did for us. So fruit was 23%, or 23 over 100. Since we had 200 students, we have to double it to make the equivalent fraction 46 over 200. Which means that 46 out of 200 students chose fruit. So now for cheese, 15% chose cheese, which equals 15 over 100. Now we have to make that into the equivalent fraction over 200 by multiplying both the top and the bottom by 2. So 15 times 2 is 30. So that's 30 over 200, meaning 30 students out of 200 students chose cheese. And then with veggies, it's 17%, or 17 over 100. And then we have to double that, so multiply the top by 2, 34 out of 200, or over 200, which means that 34 out of 200 students chose veggies. Cookies was 15%, which we already know from cheese. So 15% is 15 over 100, or 30 over 200, meaning 30 students out of 200 students. Next we have chips, which was 18%, or 18 over 100. So then we have to double it to make 39 over 200, or sorry, I did my math wrong there. Should be 36 over 200, meaning there are 36 out of 200 students who chose chips. And then for no snack, it was 12%, or 12 over 100. We double that to make it over 200, so it's 24 over 200, which means that 24 out of 200 students chose no snack. So in order to check that we got all of our math correct, we're going to take all of the numbers from the last column and add them all together, and they should equal 200. So we have 46 plus 30 plus 34 plus 30 plus 36 plus 24. And that does equal 200. So our question here is asking, how does finding the percent as a rate per 100 help you find the number of responses out of 200? Well, if we know the rate over 100, changing it to an equivalent fraction over 200 should be pretty easy since we just have to multiply by 2. So then we'll go to the next page. So now we're on page 148. Find the percent of a number. You can use fractions and decimals to find the percent of a number. To find the percent of a number, write the percent as a fraction with the denominator of 100, then multiply the fraction by the number. So what that would look like is the percent over 100 times whatever the number is. And remember, all whole numbers have an imaginary 1 underneath it. So we would just multiply the percent over 100 times whatever the number is over 1. So our first example says, refer to the circle graph. Suppose there are 300 students at York Middle School. So I'm going to underline that, 300 students. Find the number of students that have cheese as a snack. So we're looking for cheese. So we found cheese is 15%. So if we look at the first method, we can write the percent as a fraction, kind of like we were talking about up here. So 15% is equal to 15 over 100. And we can make that into a simplified fraction of 3 over 20. So 3/20 of 300 equals 3/20 times 300. And we would multiply that out to get 45. So that means that 45 students out of the 300 students chose cheese as their favorite snack. The second method would be to write the percent as a decimal. So 15% is equal to 15 hundredths. 15 hundredths of 300 is equal to 15 hundredths times 300, which would be 45. So 45 students have cheese as their snack. So let's look at A. Get out my other paper. So A says, find the number of students at York Middle School that have chips as a snack. So let's find chips on the circle graph. So chips is 18%. So we can do this as a fraction or as a decimal. So I'm going to do this as a fraction. So to make 18% into a fraction, I change it to 18 over 100 times, remember our total number of students, 300, over 1. So I can reduce this fraction, 18 over 100, to make it just a little bit easier to multiply. So I can divide the top and the bottom both by 2 to give me 9 over 50 times 300. And then if you remember from multiplying fractions, we can cross cancel, meaning we can cross cancel a 0 from both sides, from the top and the bottom. Remember, we can't go straight across, but we can go top to bottom. And then we multiply. So we multiply 9 times 30 and 5 times 1. So 9 times 30 gives us 270. 5 times 1 gives us 5. Now this is an improper fraction, so we would have to divide this out to find the correct answer in simplified form. If we divide 270 divided by 5, we would get 54 students. So 54 students chose chips as their favorite snack. So let's move on to the next side. So now we're looking at percents greater than 100 and less than 1%. You may choose whether to write a percent as a fraction or as a decimal based on what the problem is. So some problems may be easier to write it as a fraction, some may be easier to write it as a decimal. So our first example is to find 145% of 320. So 145% is equal to 145 over 100, or if we reduce that, is equal to 29 over 20. Then we would do the same thing that we did before. We would multiply that fraction times the whole number. So 29 over 20 times 320. They are cross-canceling or dividing the numerator and the denominator both by 20 to reduce it even more. So then that reduces us down to 29 times 16, which is 464. So 145% of 320 is 464. So if we look at example 3, we have 220% or 220 over 100. Then we need to simplify this down to make it into a smaller equivalent fraction. So we can divide the top and the bottom both by 20 to get 11/5. So 220% of 65 is equal to 11/5 times 65. So if we divide this number and this number by the greatest common factor, which is 5, have 11/5 times 65 over 1. We would divide 5 divided by 5 to give us 1. And 65 divided by 5 would give us 13. And then we can multiply 11 times 13 to give us 143. So 220% of 65 is 143. Now we don't need to simplify all of the fractions. We can do that at the very end if we want to, but keep in mind that if you don't simplify the fractions first or as soon as possible, then your numbers will get harder and harder to multiply. Example number 4 is to find 0.25% of 58. So this time, since we're working with a percent that's less than 1%, we are going to convert it down to a decimal. So 0.25% is equal to 0.0025. We would multiply that times 58 to get 0.145. So 0.25% of 58 is 0.145. So let's try the practice problems. So B is 128% of 550. So 128% of 550, if we make this all into fractions, we would have 128 over 100 times 550 over 1. Now we can reduce our first fraction down to 64 over 50, forgot my 0, times 550 over 1. Then we can cross cancel or divide 50 and 550 divided by 10 to get rid of that 0. And then we can multiply. So we'd multiply 64 times 55. I'll do that over here. So remember, 5 times 4 is 20. 5 times 6 is 30, plus 2 is 32. We add in our placeholder. 5 times 4 is 20. 5 times 6 is 30, plus 2 is 32. And we get 3,520. And then we would divide it all by 5. So we'll do that here. So 5 can't go into 3, but 5 can go into 35 7 times. 35 minus 35 is 0. We bring down the 2. 5 can't go into 2, so we bring down the other 0. 5 can go into 20 4 times. We subtract 20 and get a remainder of 0. So that means that 128% of 550 is 704. So our next one that we're gonna do, we're only gonna do one more, is C, and that is 0.3% of 200. So for this one, since it's less than 1%, we're gonna turn this number into a decimal. So that would be 0.003 times 200. So I'm going to multiply all of this out. So what I can do is I know right away that since I'm multiplying by a multiple of 100, my decimal point is going to move over 2 places. So I'm going to move my decimal point over 2 places, and then I'm going to cross out those zeros so I know that I already multiplied by 100. Then I only have to multiply 3 times 2, which gives me 6. So that means that 0.003 times 200 equals 0.6, or 6/10. So 0.3% of 200 is 6/10. So we'll go to our last page. Our final example says, in a recent state Special Olympics meet, Franklin County sent a team of 70 players. 20% of the team competed in soccer. How many athletes competed in soccer? So we would use, this problem is using the decimal method. So they converted 20% to a decimal, multiplied it times the number of players to find the number of players that competed in soccer. So if we look at example E, it says in the same meet, 15% of the team from Delaware County competed in tennis. There were 20 members of the team. How many competed in tennis? So we need to find 15% of 20. So we are going to do this as a fraction. So 15 over 100 times 20 over 1. And we can reduce this fraction down. So we're going to divide the top and the bottom both by 5 to give us 3 over 20 times 20 over 1. Now, since we have 20 both on the top and the bottom on this side, then we can cross cancel those. We can divide both the top and the bottom by 20 to give us 1 on both sides. 3 times 1 is 3. 1 times 1 is 1, so we don't have to write it. So that means that if 15% of the team from Delaware County competed in tennis and there were 20 members total on the team, there were 3 tennis players on that team from Delaware County. So you have some guided practice problems and some independent practice problems. You also have a couple of pages on Canvas for practice. Please let me know if you need help with anything. I am here for you. And have a fantastic day, 6th graders.